Let me give you the punchline first. Genshin Impact was never meant to have an endgame, and now, very likely, it never will. Seems like this is the hot new topic for Genshin players as of late, assuming it still is after 2 or 3 weeks. I think it still is anyway, because Kecking Mains had the most recent podcast with the boys talk about the endgame issue a bit, so I assume it still is. In case you're wondering what the context for this video is now, we had an interview come out for Genshin Impact a few weeks ago, in which MiHoYo devs, or HoYoverse, or whatever the fuck you want to call them now, basically came out and said, yeah, no endgame content because anxiety, lol. And that set off a whole chain reaction of doom posting on YouTube, Genshin YouTube that is, and insert your favorite social media platform here, harder than Hurricane Ian wrecked Florida the other week. So now you got Genshin YouTube looking like this, and every Genshin streamer on every streaming platform known on the internet talking about it in some way, shape, or form on their own streams. So that obviously means that I can feed the flames a little bit too, because hey, I enjoy watching the world burn sometimes. I mean, my favorite element is pyro after all. Just ignore the fact that on my Genshin account I have Mona, Kokomi, Yelan, all triple crowned, and my next triple crown is going to be Nilo. Anyway, back to the punchline. So, basically, a lot of people seem to be shocked, slapped across the face even, depending on who you look at, when they found out that the devs came out and said, yeah, they don't intend on making, quote, endgame content for Genshin, and I'm just like, dude, you weren't aware of this from the start? Now, to be fair, clearly, I'm not the only one who kind of saw this coming, or who knew that this was a thing. Other content creators like my boy Mr. Slice and Mr. Zaja from Kecking Mains knew this too, Mr. Code too, I think, along with however many other regular players, now that we've had 2 years with Genshin, repeating the same cycle of 6-week client version updates that release, 2 or 3 5-star characters apiece, one giant region expansion every year, or maybe 2, I guess. Well, one giant one and then one smaller one, but still another region expansion technically. And however many random side events that range from, pretty interesting to resident fucking sleeper. So clearly I'm not special in pointing out how the game not having an end game was how it's going to be all along. However, what differentiates my opinion a little bit anyway from everyone else's, if you even choose to care, that is that unlike your average Genshin streamer or content creator these days, who plays Genshin for an hour or 2 a day, and then fucks off to go play something else, I'm a completionist, something of a completionist anyway. In order to illustrate to you what that looks like, here's my character roster. The game automatically sorts your characters from highest to lowest level, going left to right, so your higher level characters are at the left when you open your roster, and your lower level characters are to your right when you scroll there. Yeah, not sure if I also need to mention the fact that I have all the characters in the game, so I'll tell you this about me instead. My eventual goal with Genshin Impact, or at least my account with Genshin, is to have at least one copy of every character at max level with max talents, barring crowns of course, since I can't farm those, max friendship, and their own personal artifact set, their own dedicated artifact set, so I don't have to keep swapping artifacts everywhere, and in between characters, and at least one copy of every weapon at max level, fuck refinement levels though, all Archon and story quests done, every region at 100%, and all hangout events at 100% too. Though I do need to get started on those hangout quests at some point. I've only done I think one of Noel's routes, and that's pretty much it. So yeah. And it's not just Genshin that I go apeshit over. There are 5 other gacha games that I also play and go just as hard in, if not more. FGO, Girls Frontline, Azure Lane, Arknights, and Blue Archive. And by the time this video goes up, Nikke got us a victory too. Probably, depending on how long it takes for me to edit this video, which might be a while since my editing skills are trash, as you can clearly see. So make that 7 gachas total. The point that I'm trying to make here, besides me flexing like the dumb whale that I am, is this. I've spent the last 5.5 years or so. Yeah, 5.5 years. Let's go with that. Playing gachas at a level that few others do, for better or worse. Probably worse. And within a few months into playing Genshin, I already had a feeling that this game wasn't going to be very endgame heavy. And that feeling only got stronger and stronger over the months, culminating in that developer interview that MiHoYo gave that came out a few weeks ago that basically confirmed no endgame, at least for the near future. And the main reason is pretty simple, at least to me. The game itself, let's be honest with ourselves here for a moment, it's casual as fuck. Like, there's no PvP. Only co-op with netcode dating back to 1991 because that shit is so laggy it feels like you're going back in time sometimes with how much rubber banding is going on. And grinding materials for character and weapon ascensions is laughably easy to the point where I don't even think having every character in the game at max level is all that impressive in this game, let alone worth flexing to other people either. We have events which are mostly point-and-click adventures with participation awards known as event gameplay, and hangout events, which let you intensify your worsening parasocial tendencies with your favorite Genshin characters, because clearly VTubers were not enough for you. And biggest of all, the quote-unquote story-driven gameplay, or whatever the devs called it in their interview, which is made painfully obvious by the lack of a skip button for story cutscenes. And FGO players think that not having a skip button for Noble Phantasms is painful. Give me a goddamn break, dude. So you add all these things up, and you get a gacha game with no real endgame, other than suffering for those godforsaken artifact substats, but we call that copium from where I'm from. But here's the thing, there's actually nothing wrong with any of that, per se. Not for now, at least. Well, they could still at least try to fix the netcode for co-op, but it's kind of like Endgame. It's been busted for 2 years, so why the hell would they fix it anytime soon? But aside from that, most of the things that I mentioned earlier that contribute to making Genshin a casual game are perfectly fine because Genshin was always intended to be a casual game from the beginning, like I said at the beginning of this video. So why do I say that Genshin was always intended to be casual? Well, let's get the obvious reason out of the way first. The game is easy. I mean, hell, Azurelane has more challenging content than Genshin does. I mean, go have fun getting fucked by infinite airwaves in chapters 13 and 14. With the sole exception of Spiral Abyss, and specifically the last 4 floors, there's nothing in Genshin's gameplay that requires you or even encourages you to grind to make your account stronger, only to really deal with the escalating world levels, but that's really about it. At least not to the same extent that, most other gachas would do the same, right? To encourage you to invest into your characters and invest into your units and make them stronger for content later on down the road that you need to prepare for. There's just no incentive to make a concerted effort to make your account stronger because the game was never designed to support that sort of, incentive in the first place. Now onto the less obvious stuff. I still clearly remember 2 years ago, back when Genshin first released, MiHoYo went around sponsoring anyone with a brain and could either stream or make YouTube videos to play Genshin. Make content for the game, whether it was by streaming it or making a sponsored video. I mainly paid attention to the Twitch side of things, and oh lord, Genshin took one of the top spots for so much longer than I've seen any other weeb game do in my decade here on this site, on Twitch specifically. Like, I saw streamers who would normally never touch a game like this, right? Shroud, XQC, Maximilian Dude, Soda Poppin', though, to be fair, I could see Soda trying Genshin out anyway, even if he didn't get sponsored, since he could just wail for characters and that'd be free content. MiHoYo went so hard on advertising and promoting this game, and as a result, Genshin exploded in popularity. A little too much even, if Genshin's social media is anything to go by. Some people might argue that Genshin was never supposed to be this popular, and that MiHoYo just got lucky, I guess. But I strongly disagree, and that's because Genshin is the first gacha I've seen to be promoted and advertised to this extent, especially overseas. to the foreigners, to the filthy gaijin, outside of the developer's home region. Remember, I mained 4 other gachas before Genshin, and for the first 3, I've been playing those ever since their initial releases. They had some advertising, those first 4 games, and promotion leading up to their releases, sure, but that was only a tiny, minuscule fraction compared to what MiHoYo did for Genshin. What that tells me is that the developers or the publishers of those gachas, the gachas I played before Genshin, whoever was in charge of especially overseas marketing when the global servers or the NA servers came out for those games, probably only targeted people who were already familiar with gacha games. They didn't want to take the risk of trying to promote their games outside of their own home gacha audiences, or they simply didn't have the budget to do that, even if they wanted to, because their higher-ups didn't think that their games would do too well outside of their home region, since they're not familiar with foreign audiences, so why bother investing into overseas promotion, right? But then MiHoYo came along with Genshin. And to me, it kind of felt like they knew that there wasn't much of a gacha audience out here in the West yet. Not because there wasn't one, but because it was an untapped market at the time. And it doesn't help that out here in the West, people generally don't treat gachas as serious games like they are in the East. I mean, just look at when Diablo Immortal was announced. But they had the perfect game that they've been working on and poured millions into to seize that untapped market with, even with that cultural discrepancy. Keep in mind that Genshin isn't MiHoYo's first gacha, and that they were already a big company before Genshin, so I'd like to believe that they knew exactly what they were doing coming in with Genshin, or at the very least, the experience that they'd gained from running Honkai Impact for like 4 years before then. So I firmly believe that MiHoYo came in with the plan to attract as many new players as possible with Genshin. They did the most promotion I've ever seen a gacha developer or publisher do for one of their games. They sponsored God knows how many YouTubers and streamers to play it, and most relevantly, they built the game specifically to cater to a casual audience, because casuals are by far the largest percentage of any healthy player base of an online game that there is. And by doing that, by casting out the largest net that they could to catch as many fish, so to say, in the big ol' ocean as they could farm as much of that sweet gacha revenue as they could. Maybe even catch a few whales like me along the way too. And son of a bitch, it fucking worked. And even if MiHoYo didn't intend on having Genshin become as popular as it is today, I think it's undeniable that if MiHoYo didn't go so hard on promoting this game the way they did, it would have never even had a chance at being in the position that it's in today. And it'd just be another run-of-the-mill gacha that gets thrown into the gacha dumpster out of sight of mainstream media. Here's where I plug a point that Zajeff brought up in his own video talking about this Endgame issue. Link down in the description if you want to go check out that video. He articulates that Genshin's endgame, or lack thereof, is intentionally designed to leave you hungry for more of what Genshin offers, and that's MiHoYo's way of nudging you towards playing and supporting their other games like Honkai, Z3, Star Rail, and whatever else they have or might have coming up in the future, and they can do that using the same marketing tactics that they did for Genshin as well. And by doing that, they'll be setting themselves up for repeat successes with the rest of their games, especially their upcoming ones. While they're probably not going to enjoy the same kind of explosive popularity that Genshin did, what they will do is establish a sort of feedback loop with their own gachas, where their players will constantly bounce back and forth from each of their games to the others because they're managing multiple gachas, MiHoYo gachas, at the same time, thereby expanding their influence and their presence in the gacha market, MiHoYo that is, and possibly even the general video game market overall even more. And I'd like to tie that point in with the stuff that I've been saying by going so far as to suggest, like I've got a tinfoil hat on top of my head right now, that this is ultimately what MiHoYo wants, to create a sort of gacha empire, as funny as that sounds, to dominate the gacha market with, especially out here in the West, where they're pretty much already doing that. They designed Genshin to strike gold, and while it was a risk that they took, it paid off big time. And now they can use that monetary and reputational success that they acquired with Genshin as a springboard to even more success with future and even current gachas. And while admittedly, this point is something that I can only say with confidence now after 2 years, it would, if true, explain the direction in which Genshin's taken all this time in terms of content. I mean, I know their name change was necessary because of their official move outside of mainland China, to like Singapore or wherever they're based out of now. But the fact that MiHoYo is now named HoYoverse is pretty telling. And aside from my little tinfoil hat conspiracy, the simple fact of the matter is that, as I mentioned before, casual players form the basis of Genshin's player base. If you're watching this video, you're probably not a casual. Just hazarding a guess here. Instead, you watch Genshin content that other people make on YouTube, on Twitch, on Twitter, wherever you're active in. And those are the places where you can find other people like yourself who are also more invested into the game than the average casual Genshin player is. So it's easy to form this little media echo chamber, I guess you could call it, around yourself that gives you the impression that there are more of you than there are. Unfortunately, as I already mentioned before, but I'll red pill you again just to remind you, those of us who grind Genshin and go hard on it, we're the minority. That's just how it is for every gacha. To have a healthy player base, a majority needs to be casual. People who aren't that committed to it and just play to have fun mainly, because that's what video games are to them, to most people, just fun things to do. Because once it stops being fun, they'll also stop playing until something new in the game happens, like a content update, or they have a fundamental change in the way they think of that game and want to take it more seriously. The casual audience here creates the foundation on which the game thrives for 2 reasons. First, they're more likely to spend on it if it's got like microtransactions, for example, especially if it's a gacha, because content is typically paywalled behind gacha mechanics, which means it's the only way to get that content, like characters and weapons. And the reason why they're more likely to spend is because they don't spend as much time on the game like us hardcore players do. When you grind Genshin, right, you can eventually do all the content by spending a few hours on it every day, even as a free-to-play. It's one of the reasons that contributes to Genshin's popularity, right? The fact that the barrier to entry for this game is so low and accessible for everyone involved. But that involves you, if you choose to spend that amount of time, that involves you dedicating time to the game, right? Time that a lot of casual players either don't have or don't want to put into Genshin because they want to spend it doing other things, right? Watch anime, play other games, or whatever else. So that in turn contributes to them spending money to enjoy content. And the content that they can enjoy, even if they don't grind a game, are new characters and weapons, or, in other words, gacha. The second reason is, because they're spending less time on the game itself, they have more time to do other things that may still be related to the game somehow, just not from a hardcore content producing perspective. I'm talking about the fan artists, the cosplayers, the animators, the memes. Hell, there are some people out there who recreate the food that you can make in Genshin, but IRL. These are the people who are some of the basic building blocks of a vibrant online community for any online game, but especially for gachas, right? Because they create content that appeals to all members of the community, like stuff that we can all recognize and appreciate. So the more of these people you got, the more content outside the game that they produce, and the more the community grows until it gets to the point where the community becomes a sort of self-perpetuating machine that can do all or most of its own advertising and keep growing on its own without any help from like the developers or anything, at least until a certain point. It's these people that MiHoYo is catering to, because these people are the most likely to just pay for the content that they produce. MiHoYo produces, that is. Not people like me or even you watching this video right now. Because not everyone is like me, where if they wail on a gacha, they're also going to put in the time and effort to get everyone to max level and shit like that. I'm well aware that I am in the extreme minority of demographic when it comes to like Genshin players or even just general gacha players as a whole, and I'm not going to pretend like I'm anything more important than that. I am fully aware that MiHoYo does not and will not prioritize players like me because as much money as I give him for my big booba pixels, right? I'm just one guy who's dumb enough to give a gacha dev my money because I can't seem to resist the horny ever. Accordingly, we hardcore players, from a revenue perspective, don't stand a damn chance against everyone else, like all the casuals. And it's made worse by the fact that many dedicated players out there, like I believe Zajev, I think he's free to play, and others are, well, free to play. So they don't pay anything at all. Nothing wrong with that. Let me be clear. Take it from some dumbass like me, who wails in 4 out of his 6 gacha games, probably 5 out of 7 soon. Like not setting fire to Benjamins every 2 or 3 weeks is a great way to keep your money, right? Who would have thought? But MiHoYo doesn't give a fuck about that. They care about what number is on their monthly earnings. They care about this. And let me also clear up one more thing before we move on, since I recognize that at this point I'm probably sounding like I'm super anti-casual and I'm all, those filthy casuals ruining my precious endgame Genshin experience. But no, like casual, hardcore, free-to-play, whale, I don't worry or even care about that sort of thing. Most of the time, at least, because as long as no one's being all elitist about what they are, then we're good. So assuming that doesn't happen, Genshin has the largest community that I've ever had the pleasure or displeasure sometimes of being a part of. Despite being basically a no-name content creator for this game on YouTube, at least. And there's more than enough of everyone from each category to keep this community and the game running for years to come. Like, play the way you want, pay for the gacha if you want. The most important thing is that you're having fun with the game, and you still enjoy what it has to offer. And along those same lines, right, if the lack of endgame for Genshin is a deal breaker for you, there's no shame in, like, you know, taking a break from the game and coming back for future content updates when there's stuff to do, or hell, even just quitting altogether, since it's clear that the game most likely will never offer what you truly want out of it. You really should have known this a long time ago, but hey, at least you know now with a lot more certainty. So, for those of you hardcore players like me who still want to stick it out because you've still got good supplies of copium, that sweet, sweet copium for a possibility of Genshin Endgame, is there any hope for us Endgame bros? Like, is this the end of the line now that MiHoYo's come out and flat out said that they intend to have Spiral Abyss be the pinnacle of our Genshin Endgame, peak Genshin Endgame, so to say? Well, there is, at least in my opinion. It's not much, but at least it's something. I elaborated on why the casuals are important for a game's community because of all the stuff that they do outside of the game, for the game. But you might have noticed that I didn't mention the kinds of things that us hardcore boys do for the game as well. These are the grinders like me, the TC boys, or the smart boys, as I like to call them. The Twitch chatters who spam Mr. Code or Mr. Zajev or Mr. Slice or other streamers that, for that matter, with their UIDs so they can flex their best free-to-play builds on their streams when they go to check them out on like Enka, on that one Enka website or something like that. There's something that we do that casuals don't, and guess what that is? Play the fucking game.
Play the fucking game, sir.
Now, obviously casuals also play the game too, so in case someone takes that the wrong way, I'm not trying to say that casuals don't ever touch the game itself, and all they know how to do is roll gacha, but they just don't play the game as much as we do. They'll know the basics, right? Combat, exploration, press E to use skill, and press Q to ult, that sort of stuff. But what they're not going to know, or likely not going to know, is, like, for example, what kind of artifact set does a character prefer or perform best with, even. They're not going to know proper rotations for teams. When they wail for new 5-star or even 4-star characters, they might start to think about what constellation level is optimal for them. But since they don't play the game enough to really break down or be able to understand what a character's constellation effects mean or what they do, they'll need to refer to someone else who can. And that's where we come in, to provide that game knowledge that they haven't spent the time learning, and it just so happens that we've already done that for them, right? And all they need to do is either ask the right people or look for those resources that have already been made and posted online a lot of the time to learn about the things that they want to know. The thing about casuals is that they can care about some of the more in-depth stuff too, even if it's not normally their main thing, just like how many of us hardcore players can't draw for shit, but we can still appreciate good fan art, especially of our own favorite characters. And so when casuals do want to know more about the game mechanically, beyond just basic entry-level shit and running around an overworld playing California Wildfire Simulator, they have the ability to do so, and at any time. And that's important because it's a way to connect with the game in a way that memes, cosplay, and other fluffy bullshit outside the game just can't provide. Because it's one thing to enjoy seeing some great and or juicy fan art of your favorite characters, but it's also another thing entirely to be able to say that you know how your favorite characters work in the game itself, and that you know how to play them in whatever way you want. As nice as it is to see some fan art of Mona with like the fattest ass you've ever seen crop up on your Twitter feed, it's also pretty nice destroying Spiral Abyss and getting 36 stars with her. And I don't think anyone would mind having that sort of knowledge or ability. It just comes down to whether you feel like it's worth your time and effort to go out and acquire it. Long story short, the dedicated players of Genshin Impact provide the gameplay depth to it that makes it worthy of being called a game in the first place. More accurately, they prove that the game does in fact have an immense amount of mechanical depth and nuance to it despite its gacha game nature, and consequently, the fact that it is more than capable of supporting fun and sustainable endgame content. If nothing else, right, they are the ones who serve as the anchors of the game to ensure that there are still people playing it day in and day out, even when the casual players have either moved on or only come back every once in a while when there's new stuff to do or new characters to waste money on. Because guess what? At the end of the day, Genshin Impact is a game. Yes, I know, it's very surprising. It's a gacha game, sure, and there's no getting around that. And think what you will about gacha mechanics and such. Hell, I hate gacha as a game mechanic, and yet here I am playing, 6 or 7 gachas at the same time? But Genshin is still a game with a robust system of mechanics that have layers of complexity to them that go deeper than what most people, mainly casuals, are aware of. As much as the devs might call this a quote-unquote story-driven experience or whatever exact wording they used, this isn't a visual novel or a movie, it's a game. And there's simply too much to its gameplay to be considered otherwise. However, this importance that the dedicated players like us bring to the community that I'm talking about here, unfortunately, is not something that can be felt immediately, at least not to most casuals or outside observers at large, simply because the content that we produce and the game knowledge that only we have aren't typically things that are easily digestible or conspicuous, like, fan art on Twitter or memes are, since you'd have to have a certain level of commitment to the game already to begin with in order to understand things like, internal cooldowns, elemental application levels, and why Mr. Slice is the defense archon, or even be aware that these things are things in the first place. So that means that if all of a sudden, hypothetically speaking of course, all of us endgame players were to just drop Genshin tomorrow, just quit cold turkey and never look back, that probably wouldn't affect MiHoYo too much because the casuals are still there to play and spend money on the game. And since most casuals don't care too much for super in-depth gameplay, if what MiHoYo said in that one interview that other week was anything to go by, since apparently it'll induce too much anxiety in them. Ooh, so scary, right? Very few people will care or even notice that we're gone, because most of the stuff that we do is stuff that just doesn't interest them in the first place. What sounds more fun to most people, right? Figuring out who's the better DPS, or the better pyro DPS between, for example, Hu Tao and Xiangling, or going feral over a picture of Yelan's armpits. That and Genshin is like the biggest gacha on the market by far these days, like no one even comes close. And more importantly, at the moment, it has no proper competition in this 3D open world anime gacha genre, if I were to call it that. Some of you may point out, well, Tower of Fantasy exists, right? But I'd like to remind you that I said proper competition. So even with us dedicated players gone, since there's no real competition, like I said, as in like other games like Genshin to play other than the ones that are also run by MiHoYo, the casuals will still be there to continue supporting the game, in part because there's just nowhere else to go. Until that is, there suddenly is competition. As much as I dissed Tower of Fantasy just now, it's still a competitor, right? And admittedly, it's got a lot of features that I really wish Genshin had. Netcode. And Hatta Studio, if I'm pronouncing their name right, may eventually improve the game to the point where it does become a worthy competitor to Genshin Impact. Who knows? It might happen. Wuthering Waves, which is being developed by Kuro Game, the guys behind PGR or Punishing Gray Raven, and Arknight's Enfield, being developed by Hypergriff, the boys behind, well, Arknights, are the two that I've personally got my eyes on. And then there's Blue Protocol, which is an MMO, so slightly different, but still, the fact that it's an open world anime game, I think makes it similar enough to be a competitor to. If these upcoming games can provide near peer or even higher levels of quality that Genshin has, make sure not to repeat the same mistakes that Genshin did, notably the deliberate lack of any endgame, and make as big, if not even bigger efforts to promote and market their games like Genshin did 2 years ago, then people have a reason to ditch Genshin for these new games that follow, emulate even the formula that Genshin introduced, but do it better and in their own ways. Now, I'm not saying that this is exactly what's going to happen in the future, because a lot of shit can still go wrong during these games' development phases or even their post-release phases. But assuming this happens and everything goes smoothly, then casuals will try out these new games, which means they're not playing Genshin. And remember the part I mentioned earlier about how casual players typically don't play the game as much as dedicated players do? And worse, if they end up liking these new games more than they like Genshin, that means they're going to play Genshin less and less, and maybe even quit Genshin altogether. And when that happens, that means that their time, and more importantly, their money, will be spent somewhere else. And of course, generally speaking, the dedicated players like us will also leave Genshin if we find other games that are just as, if not more fun, have just as deep, if not deeper, gameplay mechanics, and are produced by devs who give a shit about all of their players, not just the casuals or the ones that give them the most money. Again, assuming by this point that Genshin still doesn't have some kind of reasonable endgame. And that's the thing, really. Genshin being at the top like it is, and having no meaningful competition up there, does not necessitate change for them. It's kinda like an economic monopoly. MiHoYo can do whatever the fuck they want, because there's nothing else that does what Genshin does, and at the quality that Genshin does it. I mean, you can go play Tower of Fantasy right now if you want, but I think for the time being, it's still got a long way to go, even if some of the ideas that they have are things that Genshin could benefit from. And even if MiHoYo does make mistakes in Genshin's development, for example, no endgame, at this point, like I mentioned earlier, it's designed to encourage its players to go play other MiHoYo games, so MiHoYo doesn't lose out on much, if at all, because that's how the environment is, the environment that they set up. It's a feedback loop. And if those mistakes come at the expense of their more dedicated players, the ones who are less likely to become degenerate whales like me, then so be it, since they're not where most of MiHoYo's profit margins come from. But the situation really changes when there is competition, other games to potentially take Genshin's throne. Because normally, right, when you lose casuals to other games, not only can you get more new players to replace them, or at least a portion of them, by doing more marketing and ad campaigns and such, but you can also convince them to return with new content updates and returning player bonuses, and you still have your dedicated players who've stuck with your game in the meantime. But by having no endgame, you remove a huge motivator for your dedicated players to continue playing your game. And if they quit and find another game to play that they think is worth their time, namely because it has an endgame that's worth sinking that time into, they'll likely to become hardcore players in that game and dedicate themselves to that. So unlike casual players, you lose these dedicated players forever, and you generally can't bait them into coming back unless you do something drastic that gets their attention again. Unless they're a fucking freak like me who juggles 6 or 7 gacha games at the same time for some reason, but clearly that's not most people. And with Genshin being so big as it is already, it's already saturated the market to the extent where expanding even more is going to be very difficult, like think diminishing returns and all that. So casuals who leave to try other games and end up staying wherever they go because they like them more will be really hard to replace with new ones who will make up for the revenue that MiHoYo is going to lose out on now, which means that potentially in the future, when other games like it start popping up, I can see Genshin losing a huge number of its casual and hardcore players at the same time. It probably won't be that catastrophic as I'm describing now, but hopefully you see where I'm trying to go with this. While Genshin sits up in its ivory tower all alone for the time being, it's inevitable that that won't last forever. Other games will show up and do their best to convince people that they're better games than Genshin is. And if they're successful, then Genshin needs to already have the countermeasures in place to retain their players as best they can, because they just can't afford to lose too many of them if they want to try to maintain the level of success that they've had so far. And good, solid endgame content is a way to do that, because that's how you'll satisfy the players who are most resistant to this sort of game migration, so to say, and therefore maintain the health of the game for many years to come, because a game is nothing without its players of all kinds, the casuals, the hardcore, and everyone else in between. However, all of my doom posting here only really applies in the relatively far future. None of this is ever going to happen anytime soon. So, let's get this straight. Genshin is not going to die just because there's no endgame. It sucks for us hardcore players, yeah, I know, but we just gotta suck it up because that's just how it's gonna be for the foreseeable future. All these videos that people have been making with all caps thumbnails that say Genshin's gonna die soon have the same vibe as Mtash coming out here and saying that he's gonna quit Genshin. Because let's be perfectly real, very few of you are quitting Genshin anytime soon, whether MiHoYo tries bribing you not to or not. Thanks for watching, and hopefully these red pills weren't too hard to swallow. And apologies about me looking and sounding like shit for the first half of the video. I was pretty congested. Still am, you can kind of hear it still. And I did the first half of the recording after staying up all night working on the script for this video. In the meantime, I stream Genshin on my Twitch channel from time to time, so come check it out if you'd like. If you want to ask me anything in particular about any of the gachas that I play, or about this video, or whatever. So, until then, peace.